Christine Le for those of you who don't know me. And I currently chair the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you, although I'm pretty sure a lot of you here know her already, Justine Le Goas, who is our Fulbright language teaching assistant for this year. And she comes from France, and more specifically from Lyon.
Yes.
Which is, as I'm sure you know, on the eastern or western part of France? Eastern, yes, great, great. Close to the Alps, although on the banks of the Rhône.
Yes, and this one.
One of the most important rivers in France. So today, she actually, let me tell you a few words about what she does. She has a BA in communications, right? Or media studies.
Well, technically it's American civilization, but
there you go. But she's interested in media studies,
yes.
Yeah? And she is taking a couple of classes in this field here at Sonoma State University. And the other part of her role here is to bring parts of the French culture to us, which she's been doing beautifully ever since she's arrived on our campus. I recommend particularly, she's been helping in class in French 201. She's been an assistant there with Erica. And she's also been making presentations, cultural presentations in pretty much all our other French classes, French 101, French 300, and 321 as well. And today she's doing one of her first public presentations. And by public, I mean with the whole campus invited. And she's going to speak in English for that reason. But one thing I want to recommend, if you don't already know about it, is her radio show every Thursday from noon to 2. She's on the air with a variety of guests. One of them is coming in right now. And doing a beautiful job of presenting a variety of topics to the public. And sometimes in French, sometimes in English. It's a nicely balanced mixture of both languages, so that both Francophone and Francophiles can pick their way through the program. So I highly recommend it. It's good. There is poetry, there is politics, there is all sorts of other things, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But today, she's going to tell us about the current crisis in French identity, with a talk entitled From Beauvoir to Bikini, How do French Women Balance Feminism, Diversity, and the French Republic's Foundational Values. So here we go, Justine, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, for this wonderful introduction. I couldn't have asked for anyone better. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us, well, with me, mostly today. I am very happy to see this many faces, a lot that I know, others that I don't. So hopefully this talk, on which I am unfortunately not a real expert, is really just what I've been compiling over the semester and even before that, over my couple of years in Paris mostly. Hopefully we'll have an interesting conversation that will start with this little presentation. So, From Beauvoir to Bikini, How do French women balance feminism, diversity, and the French Republic's foundational values? Again, those two women that you've probably seen, hopefully, on the posters are here, and they will follow us throughout the presentation, because they are highly symbolic. And first of all, I'd like to explain those symbols of these two women. So first, on the right and behind the dark silhouette is Marianne. Marianne, who is associated, of course, with liberty and the French Republic, and has been for a very long time. If we just try and do a very quick image analysis of this Marianne, first of all, what you have to know is that she was painted by Delacroix in his very famous painting, Liberty Leading the People. And in this, she wears a certain number of symbols of the French Republic and the French Revolution. First of all, her hat is the Frisian hat, and just symbolizes the fight against oppression. It was already used during the ancient Greek time. She also holds a gun, so again, the fight against oppression. And obviously, she has the French tricolor flag, blue, white, and red, which was adopted during the French Revolution and then subsequently as a French symbol. She, interestingly, her figure is looking behind her. She is leading the people, so she's making sure that everyone is following her because she doesn't want to go on her fight by herself. That wouldn't make any sense, and she would probably not win it. However, her whole body is going forward with her breasts spilling out of her robe. Just she wants to go and free the people. The other Marianne, is a very striking one, especially for the French. I'm not sure that you caught up on the message here, because when someone in France sees that Marianne, they will probably be shocked. Why is that? Because she is all in black, first of all, whereas the other is very colorful, as you can see. You can see a lot of flesh. Here, none of that's happening anymore. And also, she is veiled. She is wearing what probably is a burqa. And this is another sign that is very symbolic in France. She's not wearing a flag anymore. She's wearing a black cloth that could almost appear like a kind of a gun in the way that it's menacing. And she is not looking anywhere in particular anymore. Her gaze is lost, and we don't know exactly where. Those two figures, in a way, are menacing for different reasons. This one because it's menacing, the status quo of the monarchy, and this one because being all in black, some have said, when I've shown this picture before, that it's almost a deathly figure, or ghostly figure, or silhouette. And also, obviously for different reasons that are more symbolic, it is a kind of profanation of the symbol of Marianne that is so tightly linked to the French Republic. Mainly because also Marianne has historically been represented as a white woman, and although here her skin tone is pretty light, the whole symbol between the Muslim religion is not one associated usually with whiteness in France. And so these two women represent potentially two eras, and could also just be a way of saying that we need to update Marianne as an icon for the French Republic, and by doing so, redefining the place of Muslim women in France. So when we think about France today and women in France today, first of all, the context for this presentation is only the past 5 years, because obviously the women's rights movement has been very long in France, as it has been in the US, and so just focusing on metropolitan France over the past 5 years is already probably too much work. So ever since François Hollande was elected, there has been, although not because of his election, although some people might argue with that, a perception of attack on the French identity. First of all, and mainly because of the terrorist attacks that France has had to go through this past couple of years. And because of that, although women are not necessarily the ones responsible for these attacks, their place in society has been subtly, but even more so, redefined by this context, because they have to reconcile some expectations on a political and social level that, even though we're pre-existing to this time of attacks, have become more acute. First of all, the French Republic's core foundational values that you probably already know, especially if you're a French major, which are liberty, equality, fraternity, but here it will focus more on laïcité, and we'll take more time to define it later. But the core values that you probably already know, especially if you're a French major, which are liberty, equality, fraternity, but here it will focus more on laïcité, and we'll take more time to define it later. also the French feminist tradition that has been, as I've told you, a very long one, and the concept of diversity, which basically just, for me, encompasses the whole fact that many different people from different cultures are now arriving or living together in France, and that it can cause a strain on the French identity and the way that the French officials want to see it defined. Because all of this is a lot to work with, I've decided to only focus on garments and clothing in the past couple of events that have been stirring a lot of debate in France. Although it may appear futile, it reveals a great deal of the place of women and their attempt of imbalancing all of these different expectations that are very strong and very complex to deal with, complex to understand and complex to just embody. So if we first look at the French Republic's core values, its foundational values, the very first one that is in the triptych of the motto of the French Republic is liberty. It's one that you know pretty well too as Americans, although some could argue that the French define it in a very different way. You know, we like to be original, so you have your liberty and we have ours. It was actually defined, some could say, for the first time in the 4th article of the French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen in 1789. And it consists of doing anything which does not harm others. Thus, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has only those borders which assure other members of society the enjoyment of these same rights. These borders can be determined only by the law. This definition is very important. First of all, because it is the preamble of our current constitution. We are going on our 5th right now. Maybe we'll have a 6th one in the coming years, who knows? But it is very important also because it establishes the law as the only real border between what can be considered one's liberty and one's others. And that, we'll see, is extremely important for our topic today. The second value, if I don't point towards my computer, it's not going to work, is equality, which is the second of the triptych of the French motto, as you know. And it has been defined by the first, well, not defined, but it appears very early on in the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, as it is the first article. Men are born free and equal in rights. So the equality that we refer to in France is the equality in rights. And that is also very important, and we'll see why later. The third one, although it is not the last one of the motto, is laïcité. I've decided not to translate laïcité because, again, you know, we are French and we like having our own concepts. We like thinking a lot, and laïcité, although you could try and translate it, a French person will always be very unsatisfied by the word you'll find. Why is it so important? It is a very strong political ideal in French society, one that I've had to explain many times already, and that I'm having a hard time each and every time, especially because depending on who you're addressing, there's a different set of expectation, a different understanding of the word. And so the best, the less unsatisfying one that I found is that it's an ideal of the non-entanglement of state affairs and religious organizations. And that entails a freedom of religion as long as it presents no harm to the public order. So basically what this says is that, you know, the state is on one hand and religion is on the other, and there is a strict separation between the two. In the public sphere, they should not merge at any cost. Although, you know, there's one other line that is interesting here, and it's no harm to the public order. So the state still has the possibility, if needed, and if it deems that there's a harm to the public order, to intervene into religious affairs. And that again we'll see is very important for our discussion today. So what this means is that all of these different values are first rather complex, and also they're all very tightly linked with each other, because laïcité can be definitely understood as a freedom of conscience and thought, and therefore of religion, but it's a liberty. But at the same time, it is a form of equality, because by choosing to separate church and state, the French have decided to have all the religions equal against each, among the French political debate. So there should be no preference for one or the other. So that is the first set of expectations. Anyone who sets foot in France, I would assume, has to know in a way of these and accept them and respect them. That is one of the most basic expectation laid on any person living in France for a certain amount of time, specifically if it's a long time. When it comes to women, there is also another expectation, and one that is linked to French feminism, because it's a long process, it's an ongoing process, so I've just selected a few figures of French feminism to explain to you just how important it is and how present it is in women's life. The first person is Holande de Gouges. She is actually a contemporary of the French Revolution, so she's heard the liberty, equality, and fraternity a great deal. And actually, when she heard it and when she read the Declaration of Rights of Men and Citizens, she was very unhappy, which is why she decided to take her pen and answer to these men who were deciding for mankind being reduced to men, in their view. She hoped to expose the failures of the revolution regarding gender equality, and alas, she didn't really achieve so, because she was beheaded in 1793. It was a big trend back then. She was the second woman to be beheaded after Marie Antoinette. And then another very important moment in French feminism and French history is 1944, which was the date when women were granted the right to vote. It was a political right acquired rather late in history. 1944, after World War II, it was actually a perfect time to do such a huge reform in French society, because France was still very unstable politically, and so it was the interim government of de Gaulle that decided to pass this resolution. And what you have to know is that there's been historically a very strong reluctance to let women vote in France. Why is that? Because for a very long time, it was thought that women were only, the possible voices of the church, because the women had always been the most religious people in France. They were the ones who would go to church very regularly and were the most practicing in their faith. So again, that is an important point and interesting, because even though obviously it's not necessarily true today, there is still this mindset of having women being potentially controlled by higher organizations, church, men. And the last person, arguably the most important one in the French feminist tradition, is Simone de Beauvoir. In 1949, she published a revolutionary book, The Second Sex, that initiated the second wave of the feminist thought. One of her most revolutionary quotes, one that is often used, often misunderstood too, is "one is not born, but rather becomes a woman." By this, she wants to debunk the naturality of femininity, and she wants to distinguish gender and sex. So women are not automatically feminine. There is a whole path that has been forgotten, but that is very present, in which they are socialized into becoming what we want them to be as women. And she exposes in her book the pervasiveness and intensity and mysteriousness of the history of women's oppression. That was a quote from her. I wouldn't say something like that because I'm not as literary as she is. But what she really wants to do is argue in favor of women's equality with men, but also show just how far this still was in 1949, and because we still use her a lot today, probably how far this ideal still is today. After those historic figures, contemporary feminism is still very strong in France. It's still an ongoing thing. And mainly it goes through associations today. One of them being the most famous is Ni pute ni soumise, which literally translates into neither whores nor submitted. Another one is Femmes sans voile. It's actually not that big of an association, but it's interesting for the issue that I want to touch on later. And this means women without the veil. And basically, those associations argue in favor of the possibility for women to wear whatever they want. Ni pute ni soumise because, pute means whore. Sorry that I'm saying it so much, but it's their name. They organize a lot of walks and demonstrations and manifestations to really try to fight against the patriarchy that's still very present in France. And Femmes sans voile is actually an association that's been founded by 60 something women from the Parisian suburbs who are of Muslim faith but refuse to wear the veil as they consider it a patriarchal tool. Not only do they refuse to wear the veil, but they actually argue that the veil is a more modern invention in the sense that it's not being used for a very long time in France or even in historically Muslim countries. Another very promising and growing way of expressing women's feminism in France is through Tumblrs and blogs. One of the most famous one is Pétachenek, which could literally translate into pay for, assume your sex. Chère collaboratrice, which is a play on the words dear and flesh, and collaborator. And all of these try to expose the daily sexism that women are enduring in France today, where it in public places such as the public transportation or just on the street, or in the workplace. Chère collaboratrice is about lawyers, women lawyers. There's also one for the political world. There's one for basically every possible environment that women can find themselves being the target of sexism, which unfortunately is a lot of different spheres in France. So basically, feminism has always been very important in France. Well, always is a big word, but it's been at least since the French Revolution, and is still going strong today. However, it's been for many, many years mostly targeting a certain type of women, which is why intersectionality in feminism is growing today and is still problematic. Because what this leads me to say is that women, Islam, and Frenchness are not necessarily concepts that go together very well, especially because of all of these previous expectations and historic events that have created a context in which women may have difficulty expressing who they are. First of all, so going back on laïcité, what there is to know in France is that most of the French population is laïc and among the less religious people in the world. Only, as high a number as 40%, so the highest number in the ranks, because there are also those who are undecided, are self-proclaimed atheists. What this means is that there is a strong rejection of religion in France, many just do not want to hear about it and either do not understand it very well or don't really try to know it better. Against this background, there is also 3 to 4 million of Muslim people in France. And those people, although they're not the majority in France, they are highly visible. Because, first of all, a majority of them is in favor of veiling, which is a very visible form of religious identity. And almost a third of young Muslims see the Sharia law as superior to the French law. Although, said like this, you might think, what's the big deal? Actually, in France, it is a huge deal. Because there is a very strong, another one, we love ideals and concepts and ideas. There is a very big immigration ideal, which is that if you decide to come to France and to move into France, you have to assimilate to the French identity, and if not the French identity, at least the French values. And one of the big ones, as I've presented earlier on, is laïcité. So there is a very strong discrepancy between, this fact and this one. And the government being, impersonal, it's hard to argue in favor of one to the government, because how can you, make a very impersonal body just change its whole concept? It's taking a lot of time. And so the main thing at work here is also the misunderstandings of what laïcité truly means, as well as liberty in the French sense. And so this leads to, on both sides, either if people are feeling that they are targeted by unjust treatment by the government, or when the government decides that something is not French enough, I'd say, to accusations of racism and Islamophobia. And one of the best examples in the last couple of months, actually, is the burkini. So what is exactly the bikini? It is a piece of garment it's a swimsuit, actually a full body swimsuit, that also has a little tunic and a hood. What's the big deal? Well, actually, a few French mayors thought that it was not in acceptance with the ideal of laïcité, and that therefore they should be allowed to ban bikinis from the French beaches. That was a decision that was upheld by 3 or 4 mayors in southern France on the 13th of August. So here, many have asked, around the world actually, there's been a big uproar on this topic. Is it Islamophobia or simply the enforcement of laïcité? Is it a protection of gender equality and the fact that we do not want women to feel like they have to cover themselves in front of men? Or a restriction of individual liberty? And last but not least, is it the guaranteeing of a public order that is under threat? Or is it a religious inequality? Here you see there are all of the main concepts that I've tried to describe and define earlier on that are clashing against each other. And actually the Supreme Court in France, because we have one too, did not uphold this decision, and it decided that it was unconstitutional because it was restricting individual liberty. But some among the political world have thought otherwise, and we'll see exactly what they considered the big deal was about this full-body swimsuit. So, as I've said before, the Muslim women have become increasingly visible in the French media. Even though they are a very small portion of the French population, they are everywhere. on television, in newspapers. Their pictures are everywhere. And this has probably started in the 2000s with two big laws that were passed in France. The first one was passed in 2004, and it forbade any veiling of young women inside public schools. The justification of this law was that it was to protect minors that could be under the influence of things that they did not understand very well. And in 2010, the forbidding of the burqa. And this, as I've said before, if the state has to intervene into religious affairs, then it has to decide that it has to do with one of the French core values, and especially the establishing or protecting of the public order. Here, what it said was that it was the fact that the burqa hid the face of women was contrary to the civility of, which is apparently a Republican ideal, a French Republican ideal, of the French Republic. So basically, it was laïcité, which was heralded as the main reason to decide what women could and could not wear. But obviously, this was a problem on at least 3 different levels. The little comic here, is a comparison between 1966, when bikinis became a big trend, and where a policeman said to the woman, "You have to dress up because it's not possible to wear this." And the 2016 comparison, where the police officer tells the woman that she has to undress. So, evolution of expectations towards a female body. So the 3 different levels on which this was a problem was, first, individual freedom, the choice to do whatever you want with your own body, the freedom of conscience, which translates into the freedom of religion in France, and most importantly, the state not intervening in any religious affair. The feminist approach of this whole burkini gate, you could even call it probably, is the fact that it is deeply hard to understand why some women would choose to show an intra-feminine position in favor of the feminine confinement. This is what a very bright journalist who is actually a philosophy major and a religion specialist said about this. And basically it just has everything in one sentence, because for the French feminists, women should be free to do whatever they want, but if they are free to do whatever they want, hopefully we want them to be free from male domination. And apparently it is not that much the case here, because the veil and the burkini are associated with the hiding of the female body, because the women have to be modest and try not to have any image that would arouse men in any way. But in the way that the Quran sees it, it's also protection and an identification of Muslim women thanks to this piece of garment. So basically this whole issue boils down to the freedom of being whatever you want and appearing the way you want. And even though it is deeply troubling for feminist thinkers who did not know what to say on this topic, they were all over the place and they could not find a position that they could uphold for the whole time. It has to be protected. So the political answer to burkini may seem very extreme, as it testifies of the how effective the symbol of the burkini and the veil is in France. The symbol that is, as this journalist stated, the appearance of an extreme religiosity that caused a lot of consternation in France, the reaction was equally troubling for many in France. So what we have to remember is that the bikini and the veil, in a further extent, are very symbolic in France because they show the religious nature of an individual, and it is very linked to a way someone wants to define his own identity. And it also answers to a very literal approach to the Quran on which all Muslim thinkers do not agree on. Many do not see the veil as a necessary tool for women to show that they are Muslim. However, the context of this whole affair is also very telling because it is one of Islamist terrorism in France, and linked to this Islamic scare, which is, something most French people do not understand very well, all the religious matters, even for Catholicism, so even less for the Muslim religion. And so probably too often Islamist and Islamic are used as synonymous, which obviously they are not. However, this whole scare around the veil is also very telling of the place that we think women should have in society and that they have had for a very long time in France, which is that one where they are under the dominance in some way of a religious thought or men. And so actually the veil was seen in France as a symbol of the domination of Muslim men on Muslim women. But what has been actually brought about by the terrorist attacks is that French Muslim women took a big part, and they had a huge role in these attacks, not necessarily by doing them themselves, because usually they weren't the actual people who detonated the bomb, but they were very present in the radicalization towards Islamist terrorism and through the whole organization process, which was very, very shocking in France. Many did not understand why this happened. And so they were actual actors in the jihad. Although, here again, this was very disturbing for many French, because some women would rather choose taking part in a jihad, where usually women are turned into sex slaves and they do not have a lot of individual liberty anymore, but they choose through the liberty that they have in France to be a part of this, while at the same time, France is trying to give them a place where they can express themselves. As we've seen before, it's not really working. In the ideal, this is what is going on. So there was a whole crisis at that time that is still ongoing on the place of women as a minority that is not one, because women are 53% of the French population, of how they can find their place in the French society. At the time of the Bookie affair, many things have been said, and one of them, which is probably the most amusing and historically inaccurate one, is what Manuel Valls, the current French Prime Minister, said about Marianne. He, trying to explain why bikinis are very un-French and should be banned, he said Marianne has a naked breast because she is feeding the people. She isn't wearing a veil because she is free. Well, this was his justification. First of all, he tried to say that it was a protection of this of the public order, and then that veiling is banished, but in a sense, it was rather natural and normal because it was completely opposite to the French ideal and the French symbol that Marianne is. She is definitely not veiled, and she's actually bare breasts in many artistic representations. So because she is the go-to icon of the French Republic, she is a safe haven that Manuel Valls tried to capture. Although, Marianne is very significant in France. She is an unofficial symbol of the French Republic. Many just do not agree with what he said. First of all, because it just positions Marianne in a very specific ethnic and cultural vision that is actually historically inaccurate. Because some historians have argued with Manuel Valls that she was actually depicted in many different ways, and that the way that he chose to expose here was just one among others, and one that was arguably the furthest away from what he said, because her bare breasts are an artistic segment more than a feminist one. Feminism was still starting to really grow in France, but it was not one of the main what France wanted back then. And also because she does not exemplify exactly what Delacroix meant. She was not a way of freeing women. She was just a personification of liberty and not of the Republic, actually. So this is a classic example of Marianne, and so through her, the woman's body being used and manipulated by a politician at a time of identity crisis. Nicolas Sarkozy, so a former French president that you might remember and a current presidential candidate, also had his own statement on the whole affair. And he said that women aren't pressured into wearing anything because here in France, women have always been free. So what has to be understood is that Sarkozy supported the anti-veil laws and actually proposed to further them, and that they should be expanded to the public space and universities. So, slight discrepancy with what he just said here. Also, what he probably sees here, what he means is that women can be free, should be free to wear whatever they want, free from a religious way of thinking. And so that women should not be veiled if they do not want to. Obviously, he is missing the point, because on a political level and also on a private level, female bodies have always been a subject of huge regulations in France on the way that they were clothed, but also on a more private level, because the depenalization of birth control only happened in 1967, and the right to have access to an abortion in 1975. So women have not always been free, even on the simple body level. If we just look for a few seconds to the tradition of clothing and fashion in France, obviously France has always been a country where the French couture was very important, and it contributed to the freeing of the female body through the invention of the female costume by Saint Laurent, for instance. But this does not mean that it is everywhere the case. Actually, sexual harassment on the street is still a very big issue in France. And following the whole bikini issue, there was an attack, a verbal attack on two women who were wearing shorts in southern France in early September 2016. It was still pretty warm. I'm sure they were even, they should not have to explain why they were wearing what they are wearing, but there was a heat wave that explained probably why they were choosing to bare their legs. And so on the two ends of the spectrums of the clothing issue, there is a problem, whether women want to be more covered and dress up more, or whether they want to bare more of their limbs. There is an issue in France. And this goes as far as even being very present in the political world. In 2012, so it's a bit earlier on, the Minister for Regional Policy and Physical Planning, Justine Le Goas, was booed and whistled by her opponents because of her dress. She hadn't even reached the stand where she was supposed to talk and speak on, no one knows what the issue was, because the whole affair just was restricted to what she was wearing on that day. The saddest part of this event is that it wasn't the first time that Justine Le Goas had been booed or that comments had been made on what she was wearing. Similar comments had been made when she was wearing a jeans. Women are, in the political world, very often reduced to what they are wearing and their physical appearance. So underneath the clothes, is there a restriction of female liberty? There is a clear objectification of the female body, whereas on a religious side or on a more secular side, because whatever women choose to wear will be criticized, and they will never find any rest in their clothes, apparently, in France. Although, it's a bit of an exaggeration. It's not always the case, but it's a very present issue. The problem here is the deciding of what women should or should not wear, and this decision is being made by men in France, because even though the political world is a little bit more balanced than it used to be in terms of gender equality, men are still predominantly present in the political world. The whole issue regarding the bikini showcases just how many different expectations have to be crammed when women just want to be themselves. Whereas when it's the Republic's laïcité, or the feminist aim of achieving feminine freedom from male domination, the achievement of liberty, public and or private, and the implementation of Muslim choices. There's a word missing. So gender equality in all this, equality being the second biggest term, even equality of rights, does not seem to be achieved here, because whatever they do, women will be reduced to what they are wearing more than heard for what they are saying. So beyond clothing, where can we search for equality? There is a need to combine women's emancipation, as it has been theorized for centuries, well, at least decades, in French feminism, and the desire to live together as one nation, which is very important to the French, as I hope you've understood. The individual liberty and the unity of a nation through assimilation. And also, this just brings about the question of what kind of equality is possible when upholding so different expectations, national ideal that has many different layers, and personal beliefs. And so, as we say in France, actually, the garment does not make the monk, which actually is a translation of an American, English saying, which is, do not judge a book by its cover. It seems high time for the French, but probably most people, to go beyond external signs of the appearance and try to find common traits and finally achieve tolerance, which could be the third but always forgotten triptych of the French motto, which is fraternity. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions about the many concepts that Justine explained to us?
As I've told you, I'm sorry I'm French. I have to use concepts, otherwise I cannot think properly.
Yes.
I have two questions. First of all, thank you. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
The first, when you showed the two pictures of Marianne,
Mm-hmm.
the second one with the black veil,
Mm-hmm.
who created that, and where do you see it in France?
Actually, I wanted to find depiction of Marianne veiled, and so I just typed it into Google, Marianne veiled, and not that a few images came out. But this was the work of an artist. I can find out his name for you. I don't have it right now on me, but it was the whole recreation of the whole painting by Delacroix, with all the modern scares and problems that France was facing. So there were many different aspects, and I just chose one that I was interested in at that time, which was the veiled Marianne. It's actually a lot of work has been conducted on the symbol and the icon, the sacred yet secular icon that Marianne is, and the way that it keeps being used and abused maybe by different people, whether politicians or others.
And then my second question is, you mentioned the law in 2000 forbidding the veil to be worn in public schools.
2004, yeah.
2004, sorry. Is that law currently being enforced? And what happens if a student shows up wearing a veil?
Yes, actually it is. When they usually either they choose to keep their veil on and they are asked to leave the classroom and the perimeter of the school, because in France we see schools as very they're so symbolic of the whole ideal of the French Republic, and so they have to be completely neutral from any political or religious beliefs. And usually what young women have to do, especially when they go to high school, which is a time where they mostly wear the veil earlier on, it's not that much of a problem, they, before just, walking into the school, they take their veil off, and then they put it back on after school.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes.
So what about other religious groups, for example, like a nun, a Christian or Catholic nun? Are they held to the same standards of religious neutrality in public spheres, or are we seeing this mostly aimed towards women who are practicing Islam?
That is a very important and interesting question. Thank you for asking it. Although it is theoretically for everyone, and I've actually been present when one of my professors has asked one of my friends to hide her cross, because he deemed it too big, and so he said that, we're in a school, they stay, so just hide it. There is the question first of Catholicism being, on the decline in France, even though there's still a big part of the population that still identifies in some way or another with the Catholic religion. It is dying out. So the symbols are not as strong and they're not as visible as the veil is. So you wouldn't see many nuns in France, which is partially why the issue hasn't arisen that much, but also why there's this kind of choice of the target also.
And many nuns nowadays do not wear the veil.
Oh, when it happens to see a nun, on her little bike or something, she's deemed extravagant and so original and so ha ha ha, old France.
Mm-hmm.
Just not that present anymore. Yes?
Is it deemed too big so you could wear a small cross in class?
Well, small medals, and when he couldn't see them from afar. So if he just saw a sign that was too ostensibly religious, it could have been anything, just, a kippah as well. He would have asked them to take them off. It's just that most of the time the medal is too small to be seen and to be associated with a religion or another. Yes?
And actually really closely on the heels of Kia's question, about assimilation. So when I was living in Denmark, and we were going through very much the same public debate on integration or assimilation, really, of foreigners. And we also had in Denmark very much the same emphasis on social solidarity as you have fraternité in France. There was talk about other groups that are not sort of sticking out in the same way, but are equally poorly integrated. Has that come up at all in the French debate? In other words, sort of the squeaky wheel idea that, oh, well, it's the Muslim immigrants that are standing out so much, but that there are other groups that are equally poorly integrated into Danish, or in this case, French society. Is anyone bringing that up, that it's...
Well, I do not believe so. First of all, because the history of immigration in France is a very long one. France is, at the crossroads of many different countries in Europe. So immigration has always been a very big topic and actually I can say always, because it really has always been the case. And for a long time, it was mainly people from a culturally similar background that came to France, even though there was some, rejection of the other, even if it was closer to the French at the time. It wasn't as constructed by the media as it is today as a potential harm to the public order or the French identity, because the Muslim minority is currently seen probably as the scapegoat in France of what is not going well, especially because, even though Muslims are absolutely not terrorists, there is this assimilation too often, either in the media or just in people's minds, of those two concepts, especially against this background with Paris and these attacks.
Any more questions? Yeah? We only have a couple of minutes left, so go ahead.
Is cultural homogeny like a national ideal? It seems almost like there's a really strong emphasis on like assimilation, and it seems like there's more of a push towards like having a homogeneous culture than really embracing diversity.
Yes, and that is linked to how the French Republic was built during the Third Republic, so we're going on our fifth again, just a reminder, we've had a lot. There was a really big desire to build a French identity that was very strong and that was completely different from the one built by monarchy. Because before that, the unification of France went through the king and the king's power. So it had to go through the Republic. And so how do they try to do this? Through schools and through the establishment of French as the only language, because there were very myriad of regional languages in France before. They've all been, taken away and not being taught anymore in the French schools, because the French identity going through those values that were taught in school through the history books and so on, and the French language was so important. And that Third Republican ideal is still very present in France, even though many people don't realize it anymore. And so cultural hegemony, as you put it so well, is definitely the ideal, the dominant ideal in France. Even though it's not possible to achieve, we want everyone to feel that they are part of the French society, and in doing so, it is asked of many to abide by the French values, and in some cases, to renounce to other previous values.
And I just wanted to reinforce what you were saying before about laïcité, which is so difficult to understand here because it's so much a root of the French Republic. The previous system, the system of monarchy, was anchored in Christianity because the top of it, the king, was anointed
By the Pope.
By the Pope. right? And the schools were run by nuns and priests.
Religious.
So it was a very big deal. The French Republic is born in rebellion against that. And that rebellion is reinforced in the Third Republic. So that makes for a very, very
dense and
yeah,
complex
yeah.
situation. Because any way you look at it, you will find the main themes that I've tried to expose here. You know, whether it is laïcité or republic as being against monarchy or school or the women's position and role in society, it's all so tied with each other that it is almost, while I was preparing for this presentation, the more I went, the more complicated it was. I did not know how to start it, how to finish it, because it would have worked on the opposite way, you know, because it's all so merged. All of these topics are merged into one another.
Thank you, Justine. I think we have reached the end of our time here in Schultz 2001.